Welcome to Glamorous Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on the bell for more. Sit tight and let's dive in. The rain hammered relentlessly against the tall windows of the Mitchell residence, streaking the glass with silver trails that blurred the world outside. Inside, the house was far too silent, too still, until Daniel's voice shattered it like a stone through glass. "You useless woman, get out of my life." The words slammed into Mira's chest harder than any physical blow ever could. They echoed off the walls, bouncing back into the hollowness of her heart. She stood in the center of the living room, motionless, her hands still wet from the dishes she had been washing just moments earlier. It wasn't the first time Daniel had raised his voice, but something about the way he said it now, cold, final, almost disgusted, told her this time was different. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible above the storm outside. "Please don't." "Don't what?" He turned sharply, his tailored suit clinging perfectly to his broad frame, his dark hair slicked back as if the rain and the chaos around them didn't exist. "Don't tell the truth? Don't say what everyone's been thinking? You're a burden, Mira. A dead weight I've carried for far too long." Her breath caught, and for a moment she wondered if she'd misheard. Dead weight? She had spent the last 10 years building this life with him, sacrificing her career, her passions, her youth, all for a man who now looked at her as if she were nothing but an obstacle. "I gave up everything for us," she said, her voice breaking, tears threatening to spill. "I built this home. I supported you when you had nothing, when no one believed in you. And this is what I get." He laughed bitterly. "Supported me? You cooked and cleaned while I built an empire. Don't kid yourself, Mira. You didn't build anything. You were just there." Those words. Just there. They sliced through her, deeper than any insult he'd ever thrown. She remembered the sleepless nights, the unpaid bills, the desperate phone calls to investors she had made under his name. She remembered rewriting his failed pitches, correcting his strategies, sitting beside him as he doubted himself. And through it all she had never asked for credit. She had believed they were a team. "Do you even hear yourself?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she took a hesitant step closer. "You're rewriting history to justify throwing me away." "History doesn't matter anymore," he said, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "What matters is the future, and you're not part of mine." He turned toward the staircase, disappearing briefly before returning with a black suitcase in his hand. It was old and scuffed, one she had used when they first moved into this house. He tossed it toward the door, the thud echoing across the polished hardwood floor. "Pack your things. I want you gone before morning." Mira stared at the suitcase. It was surreal. This was the same man who once held her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, the man who promised her forever beneath the stars. How did they end up here? How did love turn to contempt so easily? "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked softly. "Anywhere but here," Daniel snapped. "Call your parents. Stay with a friend. I don't care. Just leave." Her chest tightened. "And what about us? 10 years, does that mean nothing?" "Stop being dramatic," he scoffed, loosening his tie. "We've been done for years. You were just too blind to see it." A tear slipped down her cheek. It wasn't just the cruelty of his words, it was the ease with which he said them, as if those years were disposable, as if she were disposable. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain clawing at her chest. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to stand tall despite the weight crushing her. "Fine," she said quietly. "If that's what you want." He didn't respond. He simply turned away, pouring himself a drink as if the conversation were already over. The silence that followed was heavier than his words. It was final. Absolute. Mira moved through the house like a ghost, her fingers trailing over the furniture they had picked together, the framed photos that once captured happiness. Each step felt like walking through memories, ones that suddenly belonged to a stranger. She paused at the mantel where their wedding photo stood. They looked so young, so hopeful. She traced her thumb over the glass, over the smile she once wore so easily. That woman was gone now, buried beneath years of sacrifice and silence. "Don't take too long," Daniel called out from the living room. "I don't want a scene." She turned to look at him one last time. He didn't even glance her way. His eyes were fixed on his phone, his posture relaxed, as if sending her away was nothing more than a business decision. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady now, stripped of tears and pleading. He looked up briefly, annoyed. "I hope one day you realize what you just threw away." He smirked. "I doubt it." She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and turned toward the door. As she lifted the suitcase, It felt heavier than its contents, heavy with memories, regrets, and unspoken words. When she stepped outside, the rain hit her face like cold needles, but she didn't flinch. She walked into the night without looking back. Inside, Daniel exhaled deeply and sank into the leather armchair, the quiet of the house settling around him. For a moment, a strange emptiness tugged at his chest, but he pushed it away with another sip of whiskey. "She'll be fine," he muttered to himself. "She always lands on her feet." But deep down, beneath the arrogance and the pride, something gnawed at him, a whisper he refused to hear. It told him that nothing would ever be the same again, that the woman he had just dismissed as useless might be the one thing he could never replace. And as the rain continued to pour, Mira kept walking, away from the life she had built, away from the man she had loved. She didn't know where she was going or what awaited her. But for the first time in years, the path ahead was hers and hers alone. The morning after Mira left, Daniel woke up to a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The usual clinking of dishes, the faint hum of coffee brewing, the soft rustle of her footsteps, all gone. The house was still, too still, as if it were holding its breath. For a moment he almost forgot what had happened the night before. Then his eyes landed on the empty side of the bed, the faint outline of where she used to sleep, and it all came rushing back. Good riddance, he told himself as he swung his legs over the edge of the mattress. She needed to go. Things would be easier now, cleaner, quieter. No more arguments about how late he worked, no more complaints about how he never paid attention. He would focus on his company, his goals, his future. But as he walked into the kitchen, the absence of her presence pressed down on him like a weight. The breakfast table was bare. The sink was empty. Even the little yellow sticky notes she used to leave on the fridge, reminders about meetings, encouraging words for his day, were gone. He stood there longer than he intended, staring at the blank space before shaking it off and heading to the office. "She's probably with her parents," he muttered under his breath, starting his car. "She'll cool off, realize she overreacted, and then, who knows?" But she didn't call that day. Or the next. Or the one after that. By the end of the week, Daniel started to get annoyed. Mira had never been this stubborn before. Even when they fought, she always texted first. She always tried to fix things. But now, nothing. No messages. No calls. No signs of life. He called her phone once, just to prove to himself that he didn't care, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Mira, it's me," he said, his tone casual, dismissive. "Just checking if you're okay. Hope you're not doing anything dramatic. Call me if you want to talk." She didn't. 2 weeks later, Daniel was at dinner with his mother, who eyed him carefully across the table. "How's Mira?" she asked, slicing into her salad. "I haven't heard from her in a while." Daniel shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "She's taking some time away." "Time away?" his mother repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What do you mean time away? Where is she?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "We had an argument. She left." His mother's fork clattered onto her plate. "Left? Daniel, what did you do?" "Nothing," he said defensively. "We just weren't working anymore. She needed space." "Space." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp with disapproval. "You two have been together for a decade. Space is a weekend trip, not disappearing without a trace. I told you she's probably with her parents." "Her parents called me yesterday," his mother said flatly. "They haven't heard from her either." The words hit him harder than he expected. He frowned, pushing his plate away. "What? That's impossible. She'd go there first." "Well, she didn't," his mother said. "And you don't seem nearly as concerned as you should be." Concern. That wasn't the word Daniel wanted to feel. But that night, lying in bed alone again, he couldn't stop thinking about it. If she wasn't with her parents, where was she? He tried calling her again. Voicemail. He emailed. No reply. Even her social media, once full of photos of them, travel memories, motivational quotes, had been wiped clean. Her profiles were gone entirely. It was as if she had never existed. By the third week, that nagging irritation had morphed into unease. When a mutual friend, Clara, called to ask if everything was okay, Daniel brushed it off. "She needed time," he said. But the moment the call ended, he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone. Their wedding day. Their first apartment. Her laughing at a cafe in Paris. The memories stabbed at him in ways he didn't expect. One night, after too many drinks, he drove to her parents' house himself. Her mother opened the door, and her face hardened when she saw him. "Daniel," she said stiffly. "We weren't expecting you." "I just came to see if Mira was here," he said quickly. I know we parted ways, but I was worried. She's not here, her mother replied. And frankly, I'm not sure we'd tell you if she were. Please, he said, his voice cracking more than he intended. Just, do you know where she is? Her mother sighed, crossing her arms. No. We haven't heard from her since the day you threw her out. The guilt in those words burned. I didn't throw her out. You told her she was useless, her mother interrupted sharply. She called me that night. Do you know what she said? She said she finally understood her worth, and it wasn't going to be defined by you anymore. Daniel's breath caught. She called? Once, her mother said. And then nothing. As he drove home that night, the silence in the car was deafening. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He told himself it didn't matter. People break up. People move on. She was probably living with a friend, licking her wounds. But the truth gnawed at him, she hadn't just left him. She'd erased herself from the world they shared. By the fourth week, even his assistant noticed something was off. Rough week? She asked carefully as he stared blankly at his computer screen during a meeting. Something like that, he muttered. He tried to focus on work, but every spreadsheet, every contract, every strategy meeting felt hollow. Mira had always been the one he bounced ideas off of late at night, the one who saw things he missed. Without her, everything seemed heavier. One evening as he left the office, Clara called again. Daniel, I don't mean to pry, she said gently, but have you really not heard from Mira? No, he admitted. Not a word. That's strange, Clara murmured. She's always been so open. If she's cut you off completely, she must really be done. Her words lingered long after the call ended. Really done. It wasn't a concept Daniel was used to. Mira had always been there, through his temper, his long hours, his arrogance. She had always forgiven, always stayed. Until now. As October melted into November, Daniel started waking up earlier, his chest tight with a discomfort he couldn't name. He told himself he was just curious, just frustrated that she hadn't reached out. But late at night, when the rain tapped against the windows and the house felt colder than usual, he knew it was something deeper. Mira was gone. Not just gone from his home, but gone from his orbit, his story, his life. She had slipped into the shadows without leaving a trace, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something he didn't think he was capable of anymore. Fear. Because deep down, beneath the layers of pride and denial, a quiet truth whispered in his mind. She might never come back. By December, Daniel's confidence had started to crack, though he refused to admit it to anyone, not even to himself. On the surface, everything looked the same. His tailored suits, his sleek office with its panoramic view of the city, his commanding voice in board meetings. But beneath the veneer of control, something was unraveling. Something that had once seemed unshakable was slipping through his fingers. It began subtly at first. A client meeting canceled here, a deal postponed there. Happens all the time, he told his team, waving it off. But then another email came. And another. Contracts he'd been certain were sealed suddenly required renegotiation. One long-term investor asked to review terms. Another backed out entirely. By mid-December, 3 major partnerships were gone. What the hell is going on? Daniel snapped during a Monday strategy meeting, pacing across the glass-walled conference room. His top executives exchanged wary glances but said nothing. We were supposed to have a record quarter. Now half of our revenue pipeline is evaporating. Maybe it's the market, one of them offered hesitantly. It's not the market, Daniel growled. It's us. He wasn't wrong. It was a Tuesday morning when the first real blow hit. He was reviewing financials when his CFO walked into his office, pale and hesitant. We have a situation, she said, placing a folder on his desk. What kind of situation? She didn't speak. Instead, she opened the folder to a series of screenshots, confidential internal documents, client communications, proprietary proposals, all leaked online. A small business blog had published them under the headline, Is Mitchell Dynamics Misleading Investors? Daniel's blood ran cold. Where did this come from? We're still investigating, the CFO said carefully. But whoever did this knew where to look. They accessed archived folders, things only a handful of people had clearance for. Who? He demanded. She hesitated. Well, me. And Mira. The name landed like a blow. Mira? He repeated, disbelief twisting his features. That's impossible. She's gone. Exactly, the CFO replied quietly. Which makes it more likely. These files weren't touched until 2 weeks ago. Daniel felt a chill spread through his chest. 2 weeks ago, About the same time Mira had vanished from everyone's radar. No, he muttered, shaking his head. She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't. But he stopped himself. Because he didn't know what Mira would or wouldn't do anymore. The woman he had dismissed, belittled, cast aside, he no longer had any claim to who she was. And if she had done this, she knew the company inside and out. She knew the passwords, the strategies, the vulnerabilities. And she knew how to hurt him. By January the damage was undeniable. 3 lawsuits had been filed. The company's valuation had plummeted by 30%. Investors he'd known for years stopped returning his calls. One afternoon he walked into the office and felt every pair of eyes shift toward him, whispers following him down the hallway. Once he had been the golden boy of the tech industry. Now he was a liability. "Daniel," said Jason, his oldest friend and COO, one evening as they sat in the boardroom long after everyone else had gone home. "I've known you a long time. But I have to ask, did you cross Mira?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I mean, you two were partners. Everyone knew that. Even if you were the face, she was the engine behind this place." "Don't," Daniel snapped, slamming his pen on the table. "Don't start rewriting history." Jason raised an eyebrow. "I'm not rewriting anything. I was there. I saw how much she did. You did too. Maybe you just didn't want to admit it." Daniel's chest constricted. "She walked out on me. After 10 years, Jason said quietly. "Ask yourself why." The words stuck with him long after Jason left. He drove home through the empty streets, rain streaking his windshield just like it had that night she left. He poured himself a drink, but it tasted like ash. For the first time, he allowed himself to think about the possibility he'd avoided for weeks. What if Mira hadn't just left? What if she was getting even? The thought consumed him. He spent hours digging through old company records, trying to piece together where the leak could have come from. The deeper he looked, the more he realized something unsettling. Mira hadn't just known his business, she had built it. The early strategies, the market projections, the expansion models, many of them bore her subtle fingerprints. Her ideas, her research, her words. He had taken them, polished them, and presented them as his own. And now, without her, the company wasn't just struggling, it was collapsing. By February, the media had caught wind of the story. "Mitchell Empire in trouble?" read one headline. Another, "The fall of a tech titan." Television pundits dissected his missteps, analysts speculated about mismanagement, and one particularly brutal op-ed asked if Daniel had been overrated all along. One night, after a disastrous investor call, he sank into his office chair and stared out at the city skyline. His phone buzzed, a message from his lawyer about yet another client withdrawal, but he didn't pick it up. He thought about Mira. Where was she? What was she doing? Was she watching all this from afar with a satisfied smile, or had she truly moved on? The not knowing drove him insane. The final straw came in March. A government contract, one he had been counting on to stabilize the company, was abruptly cancelled. The reason? A new competitor had outbid them at the last minute, with a proposal that mirrored one of Mira's old strategies. Daniel stared at the email, his chest tight. Only 2 people had ever known about that particular strategy. Him, and her. That night, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. The confident, untouchable man he once was seemed like a stranger now. His eyes were tired, his face drawn, his shoulders heavy. The empire he had built was crumbling. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't fix it with money or power or charm. The woman he'd called useless had disappeared without a trace, and in doing so, she had taken with her the very foundation of his success. In the months that followed, Daniel's name, once synonymous with innovation and success, became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. The perfect man with the perfect company was no longer a symbol of achievement. He was a warning, a reminder that arrogance had a price. And as spring crept into the city, Daniel stood alone in his glass tower, watching the rain fall just as it had the night she walked away. Only now the silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Because for the first time, Daniel understood something he had never dared admit. He hadn't lost a wife. He had lost the best part of himself. The morning that changed everything began like any other: gray skies, stale coffee, and a desk stacked with legal documents Daniel had no desire to read. He was buried in yet another damage control meeting when his assistant, Lily, burst into the conference room, breathless and wide-eyed. "Daniel, you need to see this." He frowned, irritated by the interruption. "I'm in a meeting." "It's important," she insisted, sliding a tablet across the polished mahogany table. Turn on channel 5. Reluctantly, Daniel took the tablet and tapped the screen. The moment the news broadcast appeared, his entire world stopped. There she was, Mira. Her hair, once worn in loose waves he used to absent-mindedly twirl between his fingers, was now styled into a confident, elegant bob. Her wardrobe was sharp and modern, radiating authority. And her eyes, those same gentle, searching eyes that once looked to him for validation, were now calm, steady, and entirely self-assured. She looked different. Not broken. Not bitter. Just powerful. Mira Allen, the reporter was saying, is the founder and CEO of Phoenix Rise, a groundbreaking startup dedicated to mentoring and funding women who are rebuilding their lives after leaving toxic relationships. Allen's story, once defined by heartbreak and dismissal, has now become a global symbol of empowerment. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Founder and CEO? Phoenix Rise? He leaned closer to the screen, unable to believe what he was hearing. The camera cut to Mira standing beside a well-known entrepreneur, a man Daniel had once pitched to unsuccessfully. The caption beneath them read, Phoenix Rise launches $50 million fund for women entrepreneurs. 10 years ago, Mira said, her voice strong and unwavering, I believed my worth depended on someone else's validation. Today, I know my worth was never up for debate. Phoenix Rise exists to remind women that they are capable of rebuilding, redefining, and reclaiming their lives, no matter how many times someone told them they were useless. The word useless hung in the air like a punch to the gut. Daniel's hands clenched the tablet tighter, his knuckles whitening. She was quoting him. On national television. Jesus Christ, one of his board members muttered under his breath, watching over Daniel's shoulder. Isn't that your ex-wife? Daniel said quickly, cutting him off. The word ex-wife tasted strange, foreign. He'd never used it before. The broadcast continued. Mira spoke eloquently about the mission of Phoenix Rise, about providing seed funding, mentorship, and training for women who had been overlooked or underestimated. She shared stories of survivors turned CEOs, single mothers launching businesses, and women who, like her, had once been dismissed by the people they loved most. Within 3 months of launch, the reporter added, Phoenix Rise has attracted backing from some of the biggest names in the tech and finance sectors, including Titan Ventures and Solaris Capital. Industry insiders are calling Allen one of the most influential new leaders to watch in 2025. Daniel's grip on the tablet loosened. 3 months? She had been building this the whole time. While he was scrambling to save his company, while he was spiraling, she had been building something new, something bigger. And she hadn't just landed investors. She had landed his investors. Titan Ventures had once turned down his expansion proposal. Solaris Capital had ghosted him after rumors of mismanagement surfaced. Now they were backing Mira. Is that, Jason, his COO hesitated. Is that our old market model she's talking about? Daniel's eyes narrowed. It was. He recognized the strategic language, diversified mentorship networks, scalability models, phased capital deployment. They were her ideas, the ones he had brushed off years ago as too idealistic. And now she had built an empire out of them. The clip ended, but Daniel just sat there, frozen. His board exchanged awkward glances, clearly unsure of what to say. Finally, Lily broke the silence. She's trending, she said gently. #1 on Twitter. There's a hashtag #RiseLikeMira. It's everywhere. He didn't reply. He just stared at the black screen of the tablet, his reflection faintly visible. He didn't look like the confident, untouchable businessman he once was. He looked like a man watching the world move on without him. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying Mira's words over and over. I believed my worth depended on someone else's validation. Today, I know my worth was never up for debate. He had heard countless speeches in his life, investor pitches, keynote addresses, motivational talks, but none had pierced him like that one. Because it wasn't just a speech. It was a message to him. And it was working. Phoenix Rise was everywhere. News articles, business podcasts, social media. Within weeks, Mira's company had become the darling of the startup world. Magazines featured her on their covers. Panels invited her to speak about female leadership and resilience. Even universities reached out to have her share her story with graduating students. Daniel read every article obsessively. He watched every interview, listened to every podcast. The more he learned, the more the truth crystallized before him. Mira hadn't just survived. She had thrived. She hadn't vanished because she was broken. She had vanished because she was building. And in doing so, she had accomplished more in a few months than he had in the last 2 years. 2 weeks later, during a networking gala, Daniel overheard two investors talking near the bar. "Phoenix Rise is brilliant," one said. "She's creating an ecosystem, not just a company." "She's the real deal," the other replied. Honestly, Mitchell Dynamics could learn a thing or two from her. "Heard they're struggling." Daniel stiffened, his drink halfway to his lips. It wasn't the first time he'd heard whispers like that. They were becoming more frequent, more confident. Once he had been the standard. Now she was. And the bitter irony wasn't lost on him. The woman he had dismissed as useless was now the industry's most respected visionary. Later that night, he stood alone on his balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. He had everything he once thought he wanted: wealth, status, recognition, but it all felt hollow. Because deep down, beneath the layers of pride and regret, he knew the truth. She had built something that mattered. And he had thrown it away. He whispered her name into the cool night air, as if saying it could somehow bring her closer. But there was no answer. Mira had moved beyond his orbit, beyond the shadow of their past. And she wasn't looking back. For the first time, Daniel realized the full weight of his mistake. Not just losing her, but failing to see her for who she truly was. And now the entire world was seeing her clearly. Mira Allen, founder, leader, visionary, and the woman who had risen higher than he ever imagined she could. Daniel had always thought of himself as the architect of his success, the mastermind who turned nothing into an empire. But in the weeks following Mira's public resurgence, that belief began to crumble under the weight of evidence he could no longer ignore. Everywhere he turned, he saw pieces of her, not just in the headlines, not just in the whispers at investor dinners, but woven deep into the very foundation of the company he had built. It started with a single folder. One sleepless night, unable to bear the silence of his penthouse, Daniel logged into the company's old shared drive, a cluttered archive he hadn't opened in years. The folders dated back to their startup days, when they'd worked out of a tiny apartment with one desk, one laptop, and a dream they both believed in. He clicked through presentations, proposals, and strategy drafts, and there she was. Mira's name on nearly every document. Her initials in the margins. Her handwriting scrawled across scanned notes. "Consider pivoting to B2B here. Market saturation in 6 months. We should prepare early. Daniel, we need a client retention plan before scaling." Every suggestion, every strategy he had once dismissed as overthinking had become the blueprint of his company's success. One folder stopped him cold. It was labeled Unrealized Concepts. Inside were dozens of proposals, product ideas, campaign pitches, new service models. All of them Mira's. All of them ignored. He opened one titled Project Phoenix. The date was 5 years ago. A mentorship and funding platform for women seeking to rebuild their professional lives after personal setbacks. The first line read, "Potential to expand globally. Possible partners: Solaris, Titan, Aurora Capital." Daniel stared at the words. The name Phoenix. The partners. The mission. It was Phoenix Rise, almost exactly as she had launched it. "She had this idea years ago," he whispered to himself, his voice a mix of awe and guilt. "And I told her it was a waste of time." The next morning he called Jason into his office. "I want a full audit of intellectual property contributions," Daniel ordered, his tone more desperate than commanding. Jason raised a brow. "You're seriously doing this?" "Just do it," Daniel snapped. 2 days later, Jason returned with a thick binder. "You might want to sit down," he said grimly, handing it over. Page after page, Mira's fingerprints were everywhere, from the initial business plan to the scaling models, from branding strategies to risk mitigation policies. In board meetings, Daniel had taken credit for them all. Investors had applauded his vision. Industry magazines had named him the genius. But it was Mira who had drafted the strategies at midnight. Mira who had restructured failing campaigns. Mira who had built the foundation, brick by brick, while he stood in the spotlight. Jason cleared his throat. "I know you probably don't want to hear this, but the truth is, without Mira, Mitchell Dynamics wouldn't exist." Daniel's chest tightened. "I gave her credit," he protested weakly. "No, you didn't," Jason said plainly. "You gave her a paycheck. You gave her a title that kept her invisible. But credit? Not once." The words stung because they were true. The following weekend, Daniel drove back to their old apartment, the cramped 2-bedroom they had lived in before success changed everything. He hadn't been there in nearly 7 years. The neighborhood had transformed, new shops, new faces, but the building remained the same. As he stood outside, he could almost see them again. Two dreamers, broke but determined, plotting a future over instant noodles and cheap wine. Remember when we used to stay up all night building pitch decks? Mira had laughed once, curled up beside him on that threadbare couch. One day people are going to know our names. Our names, she'd said. Not just his. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's obsession with uncovering Mira's hidden contributions grew. He read old emails, ones where she'd suggested strategic partnerships he had later claimed as his own ideas. He reread text messages, ones where she'd predicted industry shifts months before they happened. Each discovery was another blow to his ego. But more than that, it was a revelation. Mira hadn't been a background character in his story, he had been a character in hers. The realization shook him in ways he couldn't articulate. It wasn't just guilt he felt, it was regret. Deep, gnawing regret that he had never once told her how brilliant she was. That he had silenced her voice because it threatened his pride. That he had convinced her, and himself, that she was secondary when, in truth, she had been the foundation. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, a message notification popped up on his laptop. It was from Clara, one of Mira's closest friends. "I thought you might want to see this," the message read. Attached was a link to a podcast interview Mira had done just days earlier. Daniel hesitated before pressing play. "People think Phoenix Rise was born out of anger," Mira's voice said through the speakers, calm and measured. "It wasn't. It was born out of clarity. For years I was told my ideas were silly, impractical, unrealistic. But those same ideas are now helping women build companies, hire employees, and change their lives." The interviewer asked, "Do you ever regret giving so much of yourself to something, or someone, that didn't appreciate it?" There was a long pause. Then Mira answered, "No. Because it taught me something invaluable. I don't need someone else's recognition to validate my worth. I just needed to stop giving my brilliance away for free." Daniel froze. It was as if she were speaking directly to him, and in a way she was. Her voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was free. Liberated. And that hurt more than any hatred could. The following day, Daniel stood before the empty boardroom window, watching the city lights flicker against the dusk sky. His empire was weaker than ever, but for the first time he understood why. It wasn't just that Mira had left. It was that the best part of what he'd built had walked out the door with her. He whispered into the empty room, "I never saw you." Not really. He had called her useless. But she had been the strategist, the innovator, the visionary. He had dismissed her Phoenix idea, and she had risen from the ashes without him. He had underestimated her, and now the world celebrated her. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel knew the truth he'd been avoiding since the night she left. He hadn't built his empire alone. He had built it on her shoulders. And when those shoulders walked away, so did everything that made him great. It was a gray, wind-swept morning in late April when the envelope arrived. Daniel was sitting in his office, staring blankly at yet another declining revenue report, when his assistant, Lily, knocked softly on the door. "Mail for you," she said, placing a small, cream-colored envelope on his desk. It stood out among the usual stack of invoices and legal documents. No company logo, no return address. Just his name, handwritten in delicate cursive he hadn't seen in months. He stared at it for a long moment, his chest tightening. He didn't need to open it to know who it was from. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, precise, familiar. He took a deep breath and began to read. "Daniel, thank you. Thank you for teaching me what I never want to become. Thank you for showing me that my worth is not defined by your approval. I found myself the day you threw me out, not because I needed you to leave me, but because I needed to see that I could stand without you. I wish you peace, truly. Mira." He read the words once, twice, a third time, and still they didn't lose their impact. Each sentence was a scalpel, cutting through the armor he had built around his heart. This wasn't a message of anger or revenge. There was no bitterness, no accusation. It was worse, it was calm, final, resolute. She had thanked him. He leaned back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. "Thank you," he whispered aloud, as if saying the words would make them make sense. But they didn't. How could she thank him for the worst thing he had ever done? The letter consumed him. It followed him into every meeting, every conversation, every sleepless night. He would close his eyes and hear her voice in those words, strong, steady, and no longer seeking his validation. It was the voice of someone who had healed. Someone who had moved on. That was the part that cut the deepest. Mira no longer needed him. Not his apology. Not his closure. Not even his acknowledgement. She had freed herself completely. A few days later, Jason found him staring out the window of his office, the letter spread out on the desk beside him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jason said carefully. Daniel didn't look away from the skyline. "I got a letter." "From Mira?" He nodded. Jason hesitated before speaking again. And Daniel's voice faltered. "She thanked me." Jason frowned. "For what?" "For teaching her what not to become. For throwing her out. For helping her find herself." Jason let out a low whistle. "Sounds like she's doing fine." "She's doing better than fine," Daniel muttered, his jaw tightening. "She's thriving. She doesn't hate me. She doesn't even think about me. I'm just a lesson now." "Maybe that's a good thing," Jason offered gently. "Maybe that means you can both move on." But Daniel shook his head. "It's not that simple." That evening, Daniel went home earlier than usual, something he hadn't done in years. The penthouse was silent, sterile. He hadn't changed a thing since Mira left. Her books still lined the shelves. Her favorite mug still sat in the kitchen cabinet. Even the faint scent of her lavender perfume still lingered on the throw pillow she loved. For the first time, he allowed himself to walk through the apartment slowly, deliberately, as if seeing it for the first time. He paused at the photographs on the wall, their wedding day, their first business launch, a trip to Italy where she had laughed so hard she'd cried. He reached out and touched the glass over one of the photos, a candid shot of Mira looking up at him, her eyes full of love. "She used to look at me like I was her whole world," he thought. "And I treated her like she was nothing." Sinking into the couch, he unfolded the letter again and read it aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found myself the day you threw me out." He swallowed hard. "And I lost myself the day you walked away." He hadn't said those words to anyone, not even to himself, but now they echoed in the empty room, raw and heavy. The next few weeks were a blur. Daniel attended meetings he didn't remember, nodded through conversations he didn't hear. Everything felt muted, distant, irrelevant. The company, once the center of his universe, now felt hollow. The deals, the numbers, the accolades, none of it mattered. Late one night, after a particularly brutal day of negotiations, he sat alone in his office with a glass of whiskey and the letter lying open on the desk beside him. He stared at it for a long time before pulling out a piece of paper and a pen. He started writing. "Mira, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I was wrong. About everything. About you. About us. About what mattered. I called you useless because I was too small to see how extraordinary you were. I blamed you for my failures because it was easier than facing my own shortcomings. You were never the problem. I see that now, too late, but I see it. And I want you to know, I am proud of you. I am in awe of you. And I am sorry. For everything. Daniel." He read it over and over, but in the end he didn't send it. He folded it carefully and tucked it into a drawer. Maybe one day he'd give it to her. Maybe he never would. But writing it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. Spring turned to summer and life went on. The company survived, barely. The press eventually moved on to newer scandals, newer stories. People stopped whispering when he entered a room. But something fundamental inside Daniel had shifted. He no longer believed he was invincible. He no longer believed success was about money or power or control. And he no longer believed that love was something that could be taken for granted. Because Mira's letter, just a few lines on a piece of paper, had done what no market crash, no scandal, no failure had ever done. It had broken him. And in that breaking, it had forced him to see himself clearly for the first time. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation to reconcile. It was a declaration of freedom, hers, not his. And as painful as it was to accept, Daniel knew she deserved that freedom. She had found her worth. And now, for the first time in his life, he was left to find his. By the time autumn rolled around, Daniel Mitchell was a man transformed, or at least trying to be. The ruthless arrogance that once defined him had given way to something quieter, more introspective. He still wore the same expensive suits, still ran board meetings with precision, but there was a softness in his eyes now, a weight behind his words that hadn't been there before. And yet, despite all his internal changes, the outside world still saw him the same way, the man who had everything and lost it. The man who called his wife useless, and watched her become more successful than he'd ever been. It was late September when the invitation arrived. The annual Global Business Innovation Summit, the event of the year, streamed to millions worldwide, attended by the most powerful names in technology and finance. Daniel had been a keynote speaker there every year for nearly a decade. But this time he hesitated. "Are you going?" Jason asked one morning as they reviewed quarterly numbers in his office. Daniel sighed. I don't know. Jason raised an eyebrow. You've never missed it. Maybe it's time I did, Daniel said quietly. The last thing anyone wants to hear is me talking about leadership. Jason studied him for a long moment, then said, maybe that's exactly what they need to hear, from a man who's finally learned what leadership really means. Daniel said nothing. But that night he stared at the invitation for hours. And by morning he had made his decision. The summit was held in a grand, glass-walled auditorium overlooking the skyline. As Daniel stepped onto the stage, cameras flashed, murmurs rippled through the crowd. It wasn't the reception he was used to. Once, people had leaned forward in eager anticipation of his words. Now, they watched with cool curiosity, waiting to see if the disgraced mogul would make a fool of himself. He approached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. Investors, CEOs, journalists, even students. For a moment, his chest tightened, and he considered walking off the stage. But then he remembered Mira's letter, her strength, her rise. And he steadied himself. Good evening, he began, his voice surprisingly calm. I stand here today not as the man I used to be, but as someone who's trying to become better than he was. The room was silent. He took a deep breath. Years ago, I built a company from nothing. Or at least that's what I told myself. I convinced the world, and myself, that I was a self-made man, a visionary. But the truth is far more complicated. The truth is that I didn't build it alone. He paused, his gaze distant. There was someone who stood by my side from the very beginning. Someone who believed in me when no one else did. Someone who sacrificed her dreams so I could chase mine. And in return, I treated her as though she were nothing. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but Daniel pressed on. I once called my wife useless. The words hung in the air like an open wound. I shouted it at her in anger, in arrogance, in ignorance. And I believed it. I believed I was the only one who mattered, the only one who created value. But I was wrong. I was so very wrong. The silence deepened. Cameras zoomed in. The audience leaned forward. She was the strategist behind our success. The visionary behind our best ideas. The heart behind every victory. And I never gave her the credit she deserved. Instead, I broke her spirit. I made her question her worth. And when she walked away, I lost far more than a marriage. I lost the best part of myself. He swallowed hard. To Mira, wherever you are, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition. The world calls you a trailblazer, a visionary, a leader. And they're right. You are all of those things. You always were. I was just too blind to see it. A hush fell over the room. Some people shifted in their seats. Others stared at him with wide eyes. The man who once epitomized pride and ego now stood before them stripped of both. I don't know if forgiveness is possible, Daniel continued, his voice softer now. And maybe it doesn't matter. Because this isn't about me anymore. It's about her, and every woman like her, who has ever been told she's not enough. If my story can serve as a warning, let it be this. Never underestimate the strength of someone you take for granted. Because one day they might not just walk away, they might rise higher than you ever dreamed. He stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding. The silence lingered for a moment that felt like forever. And then, unexpectedly, the audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered through the hall, not polite or perfunctory but powerful. Some were clapping for his vulnerability. Others for his honesty. But most, he suspected, were clapping for Mira. The speech went viral within hours. Clips flooded social media. I once called my wife useless. She proved me wrong in every possible way. Articles called it the most sincere public apology of the decade. Talk shows dissected his words. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag she proved him wrong and hashtag rise like Mira. And on Phoenix Rise's official page, the followers doubled overnight. People flooded Mira's profile with messages. You're an inspiration. Thank you for showing us what strength looks like. This is what rising from ashes truly means. Daniel read every comment, every headline, every think piece. And though his name was in them, he knew the spotlight wasn't his anymore, and he was okay with that. This time it belonged entirely to her. A few days later he received a text from an unknown number. It was just 5 words. I heard your speech. Thank you. There was no name. No signature. But he didn't need one. He knew. Daniel stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed a reply, his hands trembling slightly. I meant every word. He hit send and set the phone down, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. For the first time in years he felt something resembling peace. It wasn't redemption, He wasn't sure he deserved that. But it was a start. Weeks later he was invited to speak again. This time not about business or innovation, but about humility, growth, and the cost of arrogance. He accepted. Because if there was one thing Daniel Mitchell had learned, it was that failure wasn't the end, it was the beginning of becoming someone better. And if his story could help even one person avoid the mistakes he'd made, if it could remind someone to value the person standing beside them before it was too late, then perhaps in some small way, it would make everything that had happened worth it. The evening was crisp and clear, the kind of night when the city lights looked like scattered diamonds against the velvet sky. Daniel adjusted his tie nervously as he stepped out of the car, the valet taking his keys with a polite nod. The gala was already in full swing inside, a charity event for women entrepreneurs, hosted by none other than Phoenix Rise. He had received the invitation weeks ago, and for days he'd debated whether or not to attend. But tonight, something inside him told him he needed to be here. Not for her, not for appearances, but for himself. The venue was stunning, chandeliers hanging like constellations from the high ceiling, the soft murmur of conversation filling the air, the clinking of champagne glasses echoing beneath the swell of orchestral music. Daniel had attended hundreds of galas in his life, but this one felt different. This one mattered. As he moved through the crowd, he caught sight of familiar faces, investors, journalists, former clients. A few approached him, offering polite handshakes and brief nods. But their conversations inevitably drifted toward her. Have you seen what Mira's done this year? Incredible growth. She's not just running a company, she's changing lives. She's on the cover of Forbes next month, you know. Daniel smiled faintly, pride swelling in his chest despite the pang of regret that still lingered. He had no right to feel proud, and yet he was. Because no matter what had happened between them, he would always admire her strength, her brilliance, her courage to rise from the ashes of what he'd broken. Then across the room he saw her. Mira. Time seemed to slow. She was speaking with a group of young women near the stage, her posture poised and confident, her laughter soft but commanding attention. She was radiant, not in the glamorous surface-level way that cameras loved, but in the deeper, more profound way of someone who was at peace with herself. Gone was the timid woman who had once shrunk beneath his criticism. This Mira owned the space she stood in. For a long moment, Daniel simply watched her. Memories flooded back. The first time he saw her in college, the nights they spent dreaming of building something together, the life they shared before pride and ego tore it apart. And then, as if sensing his gaze, she turned. Their eyes met. It was a small moment, barely a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Mira's expression didn't change. There was no shock, no bitterness, no sadness. Just calm recognition. Then, with that same quiet grace that now defined her, she excused herself from the group and walked toward him. Daniel, she said when she reached him, her voice steady and warm. It wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was simply kind. Mira, he breathed, his throat tightening. You look incredible. Thank you. She smiled politely. It's been a long time. Too long, he admitted, shifting awkwardly. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. I wasn't sure I did, she replied honestly, though there was no malice in her tone. But I'm glad you're here. They stood there for a moment in silence, surrounded by the hum of conversation and music, as if the rest of the room had faded away. Finally, Daniel found the courage to speak. I watched everything, he said softly. Every interview. Every article. You've built something extraordinary, Mira. Something the world truly needs. Thank you, she said, and he could tell she meant it. It's been healing. I meant what I said at the summit, he continued, his voice trembling slightly. Every word. I was a fool, blind, selfish, arrogant. I thought I was the reason for our success, but I was wrong. Was you. It was always you. Mira's eyes softened. I know. The simplicity of her words stunned him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She had already forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own peace. I don't expect anything, Daniel said quickly. Not forgiveness. Not friendship. I wanted to see you. To tell you how proud I am of you. And to say that I'm sorry, not just for what I said, but for who I was. Mira studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. Then she smiled, a real genuine smile. I know that too. And with that, she extended her hand. Daniel hesitated before taking it, the warmth of her touch grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the touch of lovers rekindling an old flame, nor of strangers mending a broken bond. It was the handshake of two people who had shared a chapter of their lives and accepted that it was over. You're stronger than I ever was, Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with both admiration and sorrow. Mira shook her head gently. No. I just stopped letting you define my worth. The words struck him deeply, not as an accusation but as a truth he needed to hear. And somehow hearing them didn't hurt. Instead they brought a strange sense of closure. Are you happy? He asked finally. She took a deep breath, her smile widening. I am. More than I ever thought I could be. He nodded slowly. Then I'm happy too. They stood there for a moment longer, two people who had once shared everything and now shared nothing but respect. Then with a final squeeze of his hand, Mira stepped back. It was good seeing you, Daniel, she said softly. You too, Mira. And just like that, she turned and walked away, her silhouette dissolving into the crowd, graceful, radiant, unstoppable. Daniel watched her go, a bittersweet smile playing at his lips. This was not a love rekindled. It was something deeper, something purer, a full-circle moment where regret gave way to gratitude, and the past finally released its hold on them both. As he left the gala that night, the city lights seemed a little brighter, the air a little lighter. He had come full circle, from arrogance to humility, from bitterness to acceptance. And though he would carry the weight of his mistakes forever, he would also carry the lessons they taught him. Mira had risen from the ashes. And in doing so, she had forced him to rise too, not beside her but in his own way. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some end with peace. And that night, under the vast city sky, Daniel finally found his. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story.